Good morning, it's Joyful Christian Hermit. Had some other name suggestions, but I think what I'm going to do is I might start another site that involves the hermit life and the narrow paths. Martin suggested the narrow path hermit, and I like that because I have been thinking about doing a separate focus, and granted, to help myself, it's selfish, but to help focus me on the reform, the reformed hermit life, not this more lax and interpret canon law 603 how anybody wants, and living together is fine, and being noticed and having a title and all that. I realized the other day, a little conversation with the Lord, and thinking about Teresa of Avila and others, like John of the Cross too, many others, Saint Colette, that, excuse me, that sometimes things need reforming. And this was just never, CL 603 has not been very appropriately interpreted and implemented from the start. A void was left. It wasn't fleshed out. And then protocols and precedents were set. And now they're pretty much set. And if you go online and look up CL 603 hermits, Catholic hermits, they're all following a sort of a more lax path. And I want the narrow path. And I want to be a hermit as the saint hermits were. Because what they did brought real fruit, spiritual fruit, to themselves and, most importantly, to the body of Christ, to the church. So I think Narrow Path Hermit might be a good title for this other project, because I would like to get into asceticism. What is asceticism? Why is that important? And what is solitude? What is silence? What does Canon Law 603 mean in a narrow pathway? But do the narrow path to encompass all Christians, all people. I would think of any religion, really, of following Christ, following God, and in a way that follows the gospel, that follows the teachings of Christ and of the Old Testament also. And then of the saints, people that followed the narrow path, and how their lives really redounded to God in glory. They were given responsibilities in means of gifts of healing, gifts of prophecy, gifts of preaching and evangelizing. So they were given responsibilities by God because they proved themselves that they were in tune with God and focused and living that narrow path that Jesus said, and few are they who are on it. Well, I want to be one of the few. I want to be on it. I think all of you do too, or you wouldn't bother listening to my things that I read about Teresa of Avila now, or these different saints like Macarius. We learn the spiritual life and how to navigate the spiritual life in the narrow pathway. So today I saw this. I'm going to go back to the beginning, or close to the beginning of this, the mind of Saint Teresa of Avila. And the first chapter here is called The Gift of Self. And I thought, I don't know, but we'll see what it says. I'm sure it's going to be very good, because we do have to start with ourselves. That's obvious, and give ourselves to God. That's the basic. So I think they're going to get into that. Saint Teresa herself indicates the first and fundamental motive which makes of the gift of self a necessity. She quotes here, as God refuses to force our will, he takes what we give him, but does not give himself wholly until he sees that we are giving ourselves wholly to him. This is certain, and it is of such importance I often remind you of it. Nor does he work within the soul as he does when it is wholly his and keeps nothing back. I do not see how God can do so, since he likes everything to be done in order. God is very orderly. I talked about that way back in earlier videos. Even in the creation, everything is in order. And and that's why I've been doing more work. I'm working on the exterior, trying to make progress. And that's why I'm so exhausted this morning from up and down the ladder. And but it's good for my back. It's good for my muscles to strengthen the back that way, the legs and all. But if we don't give ourselves wholly or fully to God, totally to God, he isn't. How can he trust to give all of himself to us? To reveal his secrets to us, to give us graces when we're holding back. See, that's not how love works. We can't hold back. So, being the absolute master of all things as their creator, God could use his rights to constrain creatures to do his will. He could force us. But he leads us by laws in conformity with our nature, respecting the gifts with which he has endowed us. God does not force our will, St. Teresa emphasizes. Rather than compel it, he prefers to face the risk of a partial failure of God's designs and to modify their ordering, as happened after the revolt of the angels and the fall of man. The free cooperation of man is truly a necessary condition for the fulfillment of the eternal decrees of the divine mercy. Thus, before realizing the incarnation of his word, God asks the consent of Mary, whom he has chosen as co-cooperator. Likewise, in order to be united perfectly with souls, God will exact of each one its personal consent and active cooperation. A first consent, a first gift of self, even though complete, is not enough. The work of God in us follows the vicissitudes of our hesitations and our refusals, which unfortunately check it, as well as of our fervent yieldings to God, which set us free for the inflowing of grace. Perfect union requires as its first condition the complete gift of self. And I think we know what Teresa's talking about here. We think we've given ourselves to God, but yet there's certain things we don't quite want to do yet. We hold back. We don't want to give our all. Temptations come in, temptations of the world, or, we make a resolve maybe in Lent to make sacrifice, and then we ease off and think, well, that I don't want to quite go that far. We've got to learn to go that far and to follow through. It takes great discipline. I don't have it. I'm in this category here, but we keep trying. The gift of self is a deep need of love. Oh dear. Doggies. No barking. No barking. They must see something out there. Love and mercy. Love and mercy. No barky. No barky. Mercy. Mercy. Calm down. Calm down. Calm down. Calm down, you. Calm down. Settle down. If I continue. The gift of self is a deep need of love and its most perfect act. Charity attains to its plenitude and perfection when taking full possession of us. It bears us with it once more to God in a movement of filial love towards the Father. The gift of ourselves is the most perfect sacrifice we can offer to God. On coming into this world, the sacred humanity of Christ saw at once, because of his intuitive vision of God, all the divine riches that were his. Christ also saw directly, face to face, the divine nature dwelling within him, anointing him with the oil of its gladness and strength, and while making him meek and humble of heart, transporting him to the summits of holiness and beatitude. By the sacrifice of Calvary, Christ was called to unite all that sin had divided, and he was to be an inexhaustible source of grace for regenerated humanity. Christ, in the first act of his humanity, offers himself as an oblation to his Father. By this oblation, the sacrifice of Calvary begins. From then on, Jesus is priest and victim, and the redemption is taking place. This oblation is not an isolated act. It is a deeply rooted disposition of the soul of Christ. In this continual offering of himself, Jesus finds his nourishment as he tells the apostles who besought him to eat after his conversation with the Samaritan woman. I have food to eat of which you do not know. My food is to do the will of him who sent me, to accomplish his work. The offering is sincere and complete. The realization of the will of God is perfect. Jesus lets himself be directed by the divine will. He goes of himself where it leads him, where God leads him, here and there, at the time and according to the manner fixed by it, into the desert, to Tabor, to the supper room, to Gethsemane, and to Calvary. Not one iota was to be omitted of its decrees. God's will. His work finished, he himself wants to ascertain that it is truly so. From the height of the cross, he lets his gaze rest on the long roll of divine decrees in which God, by the hand of the prophets, fixed the detail of the events in the life of his Christ. Yet everything has been done. Therefore, when Jesus has taken the vinegar, he said, "It is consummated." And bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. We must place our gift of self in the light of the oblation of Christ to understand its necessity and fecundity. An essential disposition of Christ. The complete gift of self is an essential disposition of every Christian. In order to belong to Christ, one must surrender to him as he surrendered to God. For we are Christ's, and Christ is God's. Christ's oblation delivers him up to the divine will, and especially to the sacrifice of Calvary. Identified with Christ through the inflowing of his grace, the soul, ever renewing its oblation, truly becomes for him an additional humanity in which he can extend the realization of his mysteries. Thus, the soul is continually present on the altar as a material for sacrifice, as an instrument of redemption for souls. The gift of self that unites it with Christ causes it to enter into the states of Christ and to participate intimately in his mysteries, introducing it into the very depths of the mystery of the redemption of the church. This giving of ourselves, it's a complete giving over to God's will and following his will. In the way of perfection, St. Teresa lays stress on the effects of union and identification brought about by the total gift of self. A couple of times, God would wake me up and say, be an immolation. Be an immolation. I ended up the first time looking it up, and I got sort of used to it, but it's hard when the suffering gets difficult to be an immolation, but it's necessary to give ourselves totally to God in that way. And even this morning, I'm not feeling well. I'm fighting off another gut attack. I'm trying to ward it off, praying that it won't happen. If it does, it does. But I think again, be an immolation. Suffer it. Suffer it. If it's God's will, suffer it. Only if it's God's will. So, and know that God will make utilization of our total gift of self in whatever way. In sheer love, but also, as we know, love to suffer and suffer to love. Love and suffering are inextricably interwoven. So here Teresa says, the more resolute we are in soul, and the more we show him by our actions that the words we use to him are not words of mere politeness, the more and more does our Lord draw us to himself and raise us above all petty earthly things, and above ourselves even, in order to prepare us to receive great favors from him. For his rewards for our service will not end with this life. So much does God value this service of ours, that we do not know for what more we can ask, while his majesty never wearies of giving. But declares St. Teresa, so niggardly and so slow are we in giving ourselves, so selfishly, in other words, so tightly, do we give ourselves wholly to God, that we do not prepare ourselves as we should to receive that precious thing, that our gift of self may obtain such high favors. St. Teresa requires only that it be absolutely complete. Such a gift is a veritable renunciation of self in favor of God. The renunciation will be felt very painfully on one or another point, according to the attachments of the soul, but it must be complete. Again, we must place the gift of self in the perspective of the oblation of Christ. What these demands are is made manifest to us in a concrete way in the life of Christ from Bethlehem's crib to Calvary, with his continual subjection to the Spirit of God and the immolation on the cross that terminates his life, his physical life. It is to that God's conquest of us leads, the complete gift of self in anyone who accepts it, who accepts God totally. God will make a choice for each one of us, for we are not of the stature of Christ. And God, who shares to us the graces of Christ, divides also the immolations that accompany them. What part will be ours, we do not know. The ignorance along with which the certitude that our participation in the sacrifice of Christ will be only partial is the occasion for some illusions. We'll have illusions in this. I wish they would go out and play. They're having fun. Maybe I should have just stopped and done this another time. They do this if I get on the phone, though, too. They're like children. They know that they can fuss around and play and bark and get my attention. I'll try to continue. Persevere. So, It is to that God's conquest of us leads, and the complete gift of self in anyone who accepts God's will, his desire for us. God will make a choice for each one of us, for we are not of the stature of Christ, and God, who shares to us the graces of Christ, divides also the immolations that accompany them. See, it's not just immolations go with grace. Suffering comes with love. That's how it works. There's no way around it. And we shouldn't be surprised either when we look at Christ's life and his sacrifice, his immolation. This ignorance, along with the certitude that our participation in the sacrifice of Christ will be only partial, is the occasion for some illusions. It seems to authorize us to envisage only a part of the sacrifice, and perhaps to choose it. To escape this illusion and everything that would render our self-sacrifice less absolute, there's just one remedy: to habituate ourselves to make whatever sacrifice comes our way. And we don't have to go out looking or making up sacrifices. God brings them to us daily in many ways. And I'm going to do this in two parts because of the situation going on with the pups. But a friend, and she has a terrible cross she bears. They have an adult son that lives with them. He works outside the home but comes home in the evenings and eats with them and participates. And she was going to make a gingerbread cake with a cake mix. And he noticed the recipe for cookies on the back. And so she made the cookies instead. And they're not nearly as good as what the cake would have been. And she wrote to me, emailed and said, I would have preferred the cake, but her adult son, wanted the cookies, and so she made the cookies. It's a sacrifice. She made that sacrifice. She could have explained to him how cookies made out of a cake mix usually aren't very good. They really aren't. Bakers know this. They're an option, but they're not as tasty. So the cookies were sort of cakey, but very buttery and extremely rich, and not as good as the gingerbread cake would have been with whipped cream with it. So, but sacrifice, just a tiny one, came her way, and she capitulated to what her son wanted without debate, without, trying to dissuade him, explaining how the cookies wouldn't be as delicious, So just in small ways, we learn sacrifice to what others want, to be other-centered. And so that's what she's pointing out. And the sacrifices, though, can be large, too. So I'll do a part 2 to this. God bless His real presence in us, and see how they've calmed down now. But I can't trust that they'll stay that way. I think they need to go out again, or want to. I'll sacrifice and get up, and I get this special. I have a waist leash for Lovey because he's so strong. Then I can hold, plus my whole body can sort of like bear his strength, and do all that and get out. It's getting cold here, but it's the sacrifice for God's creatures. They had just been out, but no, they don't understand. So a sacrifice.